Hey folks, man, ECA here with another educational, informational, and hopefully entertaining video on the shooting sports. This time, we're going to be discussing firearms maintenance, design, and kind of just going around and looking at stuff. Especially if you're at a gun show or you want to buy that revolver, that double action revolver. This time, we're going to be talking about headspace and cylinder fit. Yeah, headspace. You know what headspace is? It's the distance between the back of the cylinder shield, that's this area right here, and the back of your case cartridge. And we're also going to be discussing how the cylinder fits. That way when you're out and about at a gun show or your buddy's house and he's like, hey, check out this gun, you want to buy it from me? You could tell if it was beat to crap or shot a lot. This is the best way that we know of, throughout the years that we've been shooting, that we figured it out, trial and error. My mistakes are gonna come into play here, so you guys learn. Don't do what I did. You get in it and then you start shooting them and they're like, well, what the heck are my case head bulging? That's not good. Headspace is the distance between the back of the cylinder shield, right here, and the back of your seated case. On a double action revolver, headspace should be 60 thousandths for the tight fit and 68 thousandths on a loose fit, and this is on a non-rebated gun. And this is what I'm talking about. You see that when you load that up, how you can kind of see the rims sticking up? Those are non-rebated rims. If you have a rebated gun, that's when you put your piece of brass in, it sits flush. Rebated guns are measured by putting a piece of brass in up to the firing position and then using your slim gauge right here, and these gauges are cheap. It's 2,000ths and up to 10,000ths between the breech face and your cartridge that's seated in there. But most Smith & Wessons now are just like this. They're called non-rebated. So you measure those empty and you take your gauges and you fit them back behind here. You want to make sure you push the front of your cylinder back to simulate firing of the gun. And here we're at 60 thousandths, so we're good. We got clearance on this one. So remember, for a non-rebated gun, and that accounts for a lot of the current Smith & Wessons, you want to be between 60 thousandths and 68 thousandths. That's the max. That'll prevent your cases from wearing out, especially if you hand load, and getting what's known as case head separation. That's when this part of the brass right here gets too thin and it just kind of pops right off after a couple of loadings. But if you guys don't hand load, you don't have to worry about it. If you have too much head space, which means the gap here is too big, over 68 thousandths, and you have no end shake, and what end shake is the amount of play that the cylinder goes back and forth, what you're gonna have to do is take a file and file this area down smooth, little at a time, reinsert it into the gun until you get the proper amount of headspace. Basically, you're gonna be pushing this back closer to the shield, toward the back of the gun. That way you don't have so much slop, so much room. You've got to tighten it up. And you want to keep the style that your ratchet pad is set for. For example, if on your gun, the ratchets themselves are seated, they could be seated up to about 5 thousandths lower than this donut area right here, then you want to keep it just like that, like you found it. So when you file down the ratchet pad and you file down the donuts right here, you want to make sure these ratchets are sitting below where this donut area was. File a little bit off, put the gun in, and test it. When you're testing headspace, reinsert the cylinder into the cylinder window and push back to simulate firing when you're measuring. And you want to measure each hole as it's lined up to the top of the cylinder, like it was in firing position. Because you see this area up in here, the firing position is gonna be, or it can be, depending on the gun, lower or higher than any of the other areas. So you wanna check each cylinder individually. Through use, the ratchet pad will be peened slightly. So if you've got a gun that has a lot of rounds through it and a lot of heavy duty rounds, you're gonna find that you're gonna have peening on your ratchet hands, and that's what causes just a lot of headspace, too much headspace. Heavy loads and use over time may also lead to peening of your ratchet pads here, and it'll make the hand timing too tight, and it may bind your gun. If that's the case, you're gonna have to come through and file in between each one. Inevitably, when you tighten up headspace, you will induce some end shake. End shake is the amount of shake back and forth that your cylinder does. 0 is preferred, but we can do up to 2/1000ths of an inch. That's like the max. Think of your cylinder here like a piston. When you shoot your gun, all of a sudden the piston action comes into play where your cylinder gets pushed back. If there's any end shake in here whatsoever, every time you shoot, you're gonna wear this gun out. The back and forth slamming, back and forth slamming has a piston effect, and you're gonna loosen up the gun faster. So 0 to 2/1000ths is preferred when you have end shake. A couple different ways you can remove end shake is put a steel plug right here in your yoke barrel, put it on a lead babbitt like this one, and you could peen it. Go around and peen it lightly. Test it. Test the end shake. That's the easiest, most common way that people stretch this out, and all you're doing is displacing material. Another method involves placing the same steel plug in your yoke barrel and use a piece of spring wire, which is about 60 to 100 thousandths. Oil this up and use a smooth jaw vise. Close the jaw, snug but not tight, with the wire as such. One revolution, tighten the jaws of your vise a little bit more, take another revolution. That's gonna displace the metal and push the metal out. Test, fit, see how it works. If it's not enough, do it again. You can do it in 2 or 3 different places, because remember, if you do it in one place, what'll happen is sometimes you might weaken the wall of your yoke here and it'll pop right off. So do it sparingly, but you will. Sometimes you really don't even need all that much pressure or all that much displacement. What happens if you overdo it? Well, take your file, lay your file flat, and then just file. Remember, go slow. Now we're gonna focus on the cylinder a little bit. Be aware that approximately 1962 or 1963, Smith & Wesson changed from a right-hand thread to a left-hand thread because they had guns unscrewing and binding the gun during shooting, mainly with their 44 mag. If the knurling comes right up to the shoulder, it's a right-hand thread. But if the knurling has a 1/16 space with no knurling, then the shoulder, it's a left-hand thread. Easiest way to disassemble your cylinder is to put it in a smooth jawed vise, preferably as tight as you can get it, and then just kind of give it a little bit of a crank. I've already broken this one. You've got the extractor rod collet, you've got your extractor rod collar, the extractor spring, the center pin spring, and the ejector ratchet assembly. These center pins end up being a pretty common replacement part, especially if people drop the gun. These tend to tweak really easy. To reassemble, line up the divot in the ejector rod assembly with the cylinder. Install your center pin and the center pin spring, extractor rod collar, and the extractor rod. You're back in business. A few things to look out for when you have your cylinder out. A lot of people find that their gun is binding. Are there any high or low areas? Does it spin hard than soft? This one on our gun is not, because we've adjusted it. First thing you want to look for is double check that the rear end center pin, that's this right here, the rear end center pin, sits nice and easy, slides right in, clicks right into place. If you have any jerky movements, it may be somebody replaced the pin. If you have a gun in which the rear cylinder pin is not fitting correctly, and by that you can see it binding and catching on the frame, you can use a large diameter steel punch, lay it just like this on the shield and strike it, and then test fit it to see if it works and how it goes in. It needs to hit this inclined plane so it could go into the rear hole and lock into place. Center pins are model specific, and you're gonna need to fit it. By inserting the cylinder in the center pin, it should stick out just about 5 thousandths. Push it down on the ejector head side with something hard until it sticks out, but you could use a band sander to sand that. You see? Sand it flush with the end of your rod. And then using a lathe or a drill, file it smooth. Make sure it rotates while you file and polish it to make it spherical. The extractor rod length is not as critical as the center pin. Once the extractor rod is locked into the front bolt, it could be as short as much as 20 thousandths and not cause any problems. You could trim extractor rods by using a lathe if possible. If not, you can file and add a 45-degree chamfer to recreate the chamfer you see there. That way, when it comes down, it'll cam over and lock into the bolt, into the recess and this lug under the barrel. Sometimes this front lug hole is rough. Pop out the pin, remove the lug, you'll get a spring that comes out, and clean the inside of that hole. And you can also take and deburr and use like 600 grit paper, or if you just want to use 4/0 steel wool to go around the lug and kind of clean it up. That almost always fixes it. Another thing, you do not want the front of the extractor rod touching the barrel at any time. Something else to look for is called cylinder cramp. Cylinder cramp is when you turn it like we were talking about, or when you're firing it, and it just gets tough in 1 or 2 cylinders, but then it smooths back up again. This can be caused by what's known as rod runout, also known as a bent extractor. Open your cylinder and spin it. If you see it bobbing up and down, you've got runout. Your extractor rod is not straight. Mark the high spot. I like to use a piece of chalk. Remove your yoke, and on the high spot where we marked, you're gonna take your friendly lead babbitt and you're gonna thump it. Sometimes it takes a couple of whacks. Look for the up and down, mark it, whack it. Don't do it too much or you'll stretch the extractor rod threads. Eventually it'll break. So when you do, just do it a couple of hits and try to get it done right the first time or the second time or the third time. But if you keep doing it, just be warned that you will break the threads on the extractor rod. If after correcting rod runout you still have a stiff turning cylinder, rotate the cylinder to the stiff spot and thump the frame under the barrel where the yoke joins the frame. You'll be thumping head on. This crushes all high spots. Take and you're gonna thump it right here on the high spot where it turns high. That's called crush fitting. You'll crush fit and possibly remove the tight spot from your cylinder. If after doing all this it's still tight, look at the end of the yoke barrel for a rub mark. This is the area to be looking for. You want to look and see if you can see a rub mark, or you can use a Sharpie, color it down, put it back in the gun, reassemble, and turn. Spin your cylinder. Remove and look, where's the rub mark? When you find the rub mark, use a wide file and remove the high spot. If you still have the tight cylinder, or what's known as cramp, remove your front locking lug completely. Drive this pin out, take everything out, reassemble, and test it out. If you have no cylinder cramp, then you know it was the front locking lug. These are a few tips and tricks that I have found throughout my shooting career. So keep up with it, keep trying, watch the video a couple times, think about the diagnosis, what's wrong, what you're trying to fix. Biggest complaints on these things is that the cylinder doesn't turn freely. And like I said, that is not that hard to diagnose and to fix. If you don't feel comfortable, don't do it. And you know my mantra, Buy spare parts, buy spare parts, buy spare parts. You will eventually ruin something, like I used to do, and occasionally still do. But that's the price you pay for being able to work on your own guns and fix your own guns. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, set them on down. Till next time.